area and just move it around, okay? So if we were doing geometry, right? So I'm going to keep this consistent. I'm just going to put my point or my tip there. Make sure you line this up to the best of your ability with that working pattern that you have traced, okay? I'm going to put it in there, and then I'm just going to make sure you keep your working pattern steady. And my pen has decided to kind of work. Right? Okay. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to pick it up, and you'll see now I have my bus radius in. Okay. So I've got my circle that has that 3-inch radius reflected. And this is key. You're not going to be able to do contouring without it. Okay, you won't be able to put any of the guidelines in without it. So that's really the first step for the front bodice. Okay. Now, once I have that front bodice in, I know that because I'm creating a scoop neck and I'm going to cut out the neckline, I need to put in guideline 1, which is on the neck. Now, what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to find the center of the neck, okay? Because that's going to tell me where I need to slice in, just like I have here on my sloper, okay? Just going to measure with my ruler here that has a curve, my clear ruler, and I'm just going to measure what that is. Okay, so it looks like for this drop it's about 4. Alright, so I'm going to do 2 and 1/16. I'm going to mark it, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect it to the bust point. Right, so I'm just going to draw a line like that. Okay. Now, how did I get right this distance here? How did I know how wide I want this guideline to be so that I take out the appropriate amount of excess or ease that's built into this pattern? Well, for that, I got to go back to my textbook, right? And I need to look, so we're going to flip to the next page and you'll see for guideline 1, it's going to give you instructions on how to plot that out. You'll notice that for every guideline, they have a standard measurement, okay? And that's going to tell you essentially how wide that guideline needs to be, and it's going to be, the width is determined along the bus radius, right? So that's why you need to put that in, because otherwise, where would you have, right, that 1/4 inch reflected? So for guideline 1, it's a 1/4 inch, okay? So that's where I got that measurement from. What I'm going to do is I'm going to keep this consistent, and I'm just going to measure over 1/4 inch, mark it out, and then connect it to the top and then to the bust point. Okay, so both at the neck. So once I do that, once I have that reflected, then what that means is that I'm actually already have my guideline in. Oops. There we go. Right. So now I have my guideline in. So I'm good. Now I do need to put in one other guideline for this design, and that is I'm going to keep the side seam the same. I'm going to keep that ease in. I don't want to change it. If I was changing the bust with the dart, right, shape and size of the dart, with the guideline 6, I probably would also want to change, right, the side seam as well and take out that 1/2 inch of ease that's built into it. Because if something is fitting closely here, I probably want that reflected all the way around, right, not just in the front. But we're going to leave that be, so we're going to leave the side seam, right? We're not going to touch that. But we are going to change the shape and length of our shoulder seam. So what that means is that I'm going to need to put in that shoulder slope guideline, which I wonder if I can maybe, so if you guys can't necessarily see the textbook, maybe you'll be able to see the larger guideline that I'm talking about. So I'm going to put in, it's misleading. The shoulder slope is not guideline 6. Right, 6 actually is referring to this little excess here, this wedge, that's used for strapless design. So don't get confused. But you see on the shoulder slope here on the shoulder seam, there's some excess that we can remove. And how I determine that direction or that shape is I'm gonna find the center of my shoulder seam, okay? And then I'm just going to drop it down 1/8 of an inch. And if you ask me how I got that measurement, I'm gonna refer you back to the textbook. Okay, that's where, so all these measurements that I'm kind of throwing out at you, it's all from the textbook, right? Pattern making is very formulaic. So I'm gonna go down, find the center. Right, should be about 4.5 based on the slopers we're using. So I'm gonna do 2 1/4. I found that. I'm gonna go out 1/8 of an inch at a right angle. Then once I find that and I locate the 1/8 of an inch, I'm just gonna connect it with the top of the neck and the top of the armhole. I'm not going to change because I don't want to necessarily change the length of that seam just yet. So I'm just gonna have it extend and meet at either end. So when it's reflected, this is what it's going to look like. Okay. And I'll show you why we do this using one of the dress forms with the paper pattern. But you'll, especially when it comes to the back, you'll see the difference. Okay, but those are the 2 guidelines that we're going to be using. All right, so at this point, what I would need to do is I need to cut it out, okay? And then I would need to plot where I want my new neckline to be, okay? Now I'm just gonna plot out my neckline for now, and then I probably will need some time to cut it. But I do recommend you don't cut it until you get in that, but at least the bust radius, okay? Seeing how we have to kind of manipulate that. So for the cutout neckline and the shoulder seam, it's really up to you. It's designer's choice. Now, there are 3 designs that are proposed in the textbook here, right? We have design 1, 2, and 3, okay? So you can kind of see the severity of those cutouts. Now, each of those has a corresponding instructions. My only request is that what you cut out meets the bust radius, right? So it has to be at least as deep as the bust radius. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm gonna want a scoop neck that comes all the way to the apex, right? We need to leave it a little bit above. Otherwise, we're gonna have to engage with additional guidelines, and we're not doing that for this design. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to use this edge as a guideline to draw in my neckline. Now, I do want to use a form quickly. It's just behind the shield, right? So I know we're working in the 2D space, but these patterns are worn by bodies, right? And in this case, they're going to be worn by a dress form. So when you're trying to determine where you want to place this, because, right, it's designer's choice, sometimes you're told, right, other times you're given some artistic freedom. I'm going to actually go to my dress form, right, and I'm going to say, okay, I know where this neckline falls, but what if I wanted it, say, right here? Well, how far is that, right? So that's like 4 1/4. So then I can come down, right, 4 1/4, and I can see that, okay, like that's not bad in relation, right, to where I have my bust radius. So maybe that's what I do, right? You could have it a little bit deeper if you wanted. It's really up to you on that. But that's, I find, always a really good way to kind of connect the 2D and 3D, because we get so focused on numbers that we kind of forget that these numbers are worn by people's bodies and people are not numbers. So that was what, 4 1/2. So I'm going to come down and I'm just going to mark and say that looks good to me. I'm going to go with that. Now I'm going to come over and look at my shoulder seam. About the shoulder seam, there are key markers that we put on our bodies, on the dress form. That's not necessarily reflected because our shoulder seam doesn't go, right, it doesn't have this slope all the way down to the plate. We typically feel for a ridge, and then we'll put a marker in there, right? So when I'm measuring a shoulder seam on a form, I'm not actually going all the way to the plate. I'm just going to go till I feel the edge of that ridge. Some of these are very old, so it's very hard to feel that, but this, I'm eyeballing it and it looks right to me based on what I'm feeling and seeing. Okay, so when I go for my 4.5-inch measurement, you can see, right, so right from here up till the pin that's in here, that's my whole shoulder seam. So I can take a look and say, okay, well, what happens if I go 3 inches, right? What happens if I go 2 inches, right? Kind of like 2 inches. I'm going to stick with it, right? Just so I can kind of see that effect. So now I know that when I'm redrawing this, my seam, right, is going to come from here and scoop up to down here. And I'm going to take a step back. Maybe it looks good, maybe it doesn't, right? You could even put in styling tape that you see here. This is the bust bridge, right along that bust line. That is actually already reflected on our slopers. Okay, that cuts across that horizontal balance line. So that's what I'm going to use as a guide. So I'm going to come over, right? Remember from the edge here, I'm going to come over, and I think that was 2 inches, so I'm going to go with that, and I'm going to hit 2 inches, right? So I've got my 2 markers, and I want them to meet somewhere along the bust radius, okay? Now this is where it becomes a little bit freehand, and where you also want to make sure you're using the right types of curves, okay? So before I even draw in my curves, I'm going to create a right angle at both of these ends, and that's so that I don't end up with a V shape or an inverted V shape when these seams meet. So I'm just going to bring those out about 1/4 of an inch, right? Just so I don't create any weird shapes when my patterns are brought together. And then I'm going to use, I think this larger bell shape is good to use when you're trying to reflect the strap, and then using a tighter French curve for the curve that's right at the scoop of the neckline. Remember, I don't know if Paula uses this advice, but I always have the tail facing right the edge of the pattern. So that's how I will always orient my curves. Okay, so I'm just going to create that slope. I'm going to have it come meet there, and then I'm going to change my, and again, you know, you can take a long time to just figure out if this is the right arc, the right shape, right? If you want them to meet at a different distance. It's up to you, right? Because you might draw it and think, oh, that doesn't look good at all. It's not what I was going for, right? And that's fine. You just erase it and redraw it because you'll be working in pencil. Okay? So that's how I get my scoop neck. Okay? Now what I will need to do is I'm going to need to cut out this pattern. And at this point, I don't need to worry about this section of the pattern anymore, right? I've pretty much decided that I'm not going to be using it. I'm happy with my line, and I'm ready to kind of move on and get rid of it and remove some of the excess that's reflected within it. Okay? So, what do I need